A lot of us are angry at God, angry at the suffering and pain we see around us, and God's apparent unwillingness or inability to stop it. If you could put God on trial, what would your verdict be? And once you'd passed your verdict, what would you do next?
This is Signs of the Times Radio with Kent Kingston.
Welcome to Signs of the Times Radio for another week, another episode. And with me today via Skype is Nathan Brown. How are you, Nathan?
Yeah, doing well. Good to be here.
Excellent. Now, Nathan Brown is the book editor for the Signs Publishing Company, based there in the Yarra Valley outside Melbourne. It's rainy here today in Sydney. It's always raining in the Yarra Valley, isn't it? Is any exception today?
You know, it's starting to look just a little bit like springtime, and that's a beautiful thing.
It is, yeah. You're totally right. I guess we're heading into pretty grim territory today in some ways, but I'm hoping that it's also some inspirational, thought-provoking territory as well. And I remember when I was 17, getting on the train in Warsaw, in Poland, and heading for a little Polish town called Auschwitz. Now, in German, Auschwitz is pronounced Auschwitz. So, yeah, we headed out there where the Nazi death camp at Auschwitz has been preserved to a certain extent. You can still wander through the buildings, you can see the ovens, you can see the gas chambers, you can see rooms full of things that are personal effects that were confiscated from the prisoners there. The prisoners who were, a lot of them were Jewish people, obviously, and it's a really, really sobering experience, and really makes you think. Have you been to Auschwitz, Nathan, or to the killing fields in Cambodia or similar places like that?
No, I haven't been to Auschwitz, but I have visited some of those places in Cambodia, and also within the last couple of years have visited two of the major Holocaust museums in the world, and it's pretty sobering stuff and a pretty heavy kind of story.
Yeah. There's one here in Sydney, I understand, but I haven't actually been to the Holocaust museum here.
Yeah, last year I had the opportunity to visit the one in Jerusalem.
Oh, right.
And of course that's the Museum of Museums, and that was a sobering but also remarkable way of spending an afternoon. Certainly a lot to reflect on and think about, and in that context, and watching some of the other people that were going through the stories in that context as well was quite a remarkable thing.
What sort of reactions do you see? Because, I mean, it's really interesting because there have been criticisms of these places. They're, genocide theme parks. Some people have called them bitterly. And there are certainly people who do seem to sort of skip through them just like any other tourist experience. But if your experience was anything like mine, you would have seen people being fairly deeply affected. Was that the case in Jerusalem there? Yeah,
definitely. And even some of people that are very identifiable as Jewish people in their traditional dress, and but then also military people that were going through it as well. And you could see tears on people's faces. You could see one of the things that really struck me was like 10 and 12-year-old boys dressed in their Orthodox Jewish outfits, but that's the story they're growing up with, a recognition of this as a part of the history of their people. And one of the things I noticed, there was a group that I was travelling with, about half a dozen of us that had travelled to the museum together, and we started together going through it, but just as we were making our way through the different exhibits and the things that you watch and read, we all just kind of drifted apart as we all reflected on it and went, not just because we were going at our own speed, but because there wasn't that thing of making comments to each other or that kind of thing. It was a moment really to reflect and to learn and to listen.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do remember seeing, at Auschwitz, people in tears as they walked around, looking at the different exhibits, and I remember being, just pulling up short at this little glass cabinet that was there that had a selection of baby clothes. Yeah. Just laid out there, just lying there, empty, obviously, of the little bodies that had once inhabited them, and just thinking, horrific. Like, how could people do this to other people?
Yeah.
Men, women, children. And I think politically it certainly affected me. I definitely headed in a more of a pacifist direction, after that experience, just seeing the violence that human beings are doing to each other, just thinking, how could anyone do that? How could that be a part of normal behavior?
And one of the things that really struck me at the end of the experience going through in the Jerusalem Holocaust Museum was simply the statement that this isn't the murder of 6 million people, this is 6 million murders, that every one of those people and every one of those stories matters individually.
Yep.
And that's a pretty sobering thing to stop and think about. And
it is really hard to grasp. I'm not sure the human mind is actually capable of really grasping that level of horror. There's a saying that, one death is a tragedy, and a million deaths is a statistic, and that is sometimes the way we think about it, unfortunately. But it is, you're right, it's those individuals, when we focus on them, but we suddenly grasp a little more of the horror that has gone on in places like this. Now you've retold a story of a boy who was there at Auschwitz in your article in the September Signs of the Times magazine. The article is entitled Stubborn Faith, and we'll certainly get to exploring that. But you retell the story of a guy who, in later life, he survived Auschwitz, praise God for that, and became a celebrated author. Elie Wiesel, is that his name? I'm not literary enough to know how to pronounce his name. You have to
I would try it Wiesel.
Wiesel, okay. Elie Wiesel. So he tells this story of what happened to him as a boy in that Nazi death camp in Auschwitz. Can you recount that for us? Because I think that the rest of your article really hangs on this story.
Yeah, so this was a story I read a few years ago and has really stuck with me as this moment of, that is evocative and catches your imagination, but also has some really profound and deep questions to it. So as a teenager, Wiesel was in the Auschwitz camp, and he spent his life trying to retell this story, this experience that he'd had, and he tried to write it as a play, he tried to write it as a novel, even tried to write it as a musical cantata at one stage, and nothing that he tried to do could ever quite live up to his remembrance of this experience. And it was fascinating when I read it. His published attempt at retelling the story was written up in a book called The Trial of God. And he, again, tried to tell it, but instead of trying to tell it in the context of Auschwitz, he actually took it back to a pogrom in Eastern Europe a couple of hundred years earlier. And that was where he set this play that was what was ultimately published in 1979.
So in some ways he tried to sort of fictionalize his experience through different media.
By putting it in a different context,
Yeah.
But the fascinating thing was that I'd read the play, but it was the 3 or 4 paragraphs in the introduction to the play that retold the story itself that actually caught my attention more than the play did.
Yeah.
So even then I think he didn't quite live up to it. But the story was that as a 15-year-old, he was befriended by a Talmud scholar who was in the camp as well. And amidst all the craziness of what was going on there, they decided, this scholar invited him to continue to study Talmud with him.
So it's a Jewish religious text that came out of Babylon or something. It's not in the Bible, is it? It's a separate book?
No. It's sort of commentary on what we would consider the biblical text. So the Hebrew scriptures and then the Talmud is some of their kind of commentaries and discussions about what that actually means. So then it kind of then over time has taken on a kind of as a semi-scriptural kind of status.
Right. Okay.
So it's learning
but
about
this is someone who's a pretty heavy theologian anyway. When you say a Talmud scholar, that's what you're meaning. Okay.
So this scholar invited Wiesel while they were in the camp to actually that they would, when they had some spare time in the barracks at night or whatever, they would spend some time where they would continue studying together, because as a 15-year-old boy, Wiesel would have been in school at the time, and so the scholar said, well, let's try and keep doing something normal and something sensible as an act of religious defiance in the midst of what was going on.
Right. So he may have had his bar mitzvah perhaps just before he went into Auschwitz, or perhaps this was some way of preparing him for one a little later on. Okay, well, that's Well, I mean, that's great. Certainly, you can see that the Jewish faith, really gave, both old and young a real sense of identity, and even like you say, there was a sense of defiance in continuing their religious practice in that sort of horrific context.
Yeah, and so Wiesel and this scholar built up this quite strong friendship, and one evening the scholar invited Wiesel into a meeting with two other scholars who were also imprisoned in the camp, and one of them was a professor of jurisprudence, of law, and another one was another kind of theologian or some other expert. And they decided that between the three scholars, and with Wiesel as the only kind of witness watching what they were doing, that they were going to put God on trial.
Wow.
And basically as an academic exercise to a degree, but as a way also of processing the horror and the suffering that they were witnessing around them, and that they were going to charge God with basically crimes against humanity. In
particular, neglect, I imagine.
Yeah, that's it. And so over a number of evenings, these three scholars basically held a mock trial of God. And in this absolutely crazy context of them being, in Auschwitz and what was happening to their people all around them. And they, put the cases, each of the people presented their arguments and their perspectives on what they'd witnessed, but also on how this fits theologically, philosophically, all of these things. And ultimately, after a number of evenings of working through these various debates in a very academic kind of way, I guess, they compiled all the evidence, and the three scholars arrived at the unanimous verdict that the Lord God Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, was guilty of crimes against creation and humankind.
Wow. I mean, that's pretty heavy stuff, but I imagine that I know there are a lot of people out there who would probably resonate with that deeply. I mean, I've had people say to me, well, how can there be such a person as God if, he allowed me to go through this? People lose their faith over the issue of suffering or reject the idea of God completely over suffering. And it's not a new issue, is it? I mean, it's something that humanity has been struggling with for thousands of years. Yeah.
And so as Wiesel tells the story, they delivered this verdict, and then they just kind of lapsed into silence, the four of them just sitting in this room, just contemplating what they had just said, that God was guilty of crimes against humanity. And then one of the Talmudic scholar noted that it was time for the evening prayers, and together they recited the traditional evening service.
Wow.
And that just blows my mind. Just imagining that scene of these incredibly smart people going through this incredibly horrific situation, having basically found God guilty of wrongdoing in this situation, of in the face of the silence of God, in the seeming absence of God, but at the same time just turning around and saying, well, it's time to pray, so we will pray. Wow. And then reciting the service that was, one of the practices of their faith. And to me, that's just, that's such a evocative and, something that really just catches my imagination and leaves me just thinking about how faith fits with, the horrific situations that we see in the world around us, the suffering that we see in our own lives from time to time, and where faith fits with that, and where does God fit in that scenario. So I wrote this article to share that story, and then my commentary on the rest of it was just filling up the word count, if you want to be honest.
Okay, yeah, it was a bit short, actually, yeah. Is that the weakness of humanity, that we need religion as a crutch, even though logic, defies the very idea of loving God? I mean, that's one way to read it, isn't it?
Yeah, but then I'd also think that perhaps there's something to this, that if God is God, then God must be good despite all the evidence to the contrary. And so that, one of the questions that is often asked in these kind of contexts, can God exist? But there's probably a more important question than does God exist, and that's what is God like? Yeah. And because if God is a monster, if God is horrible, why would we want God to exist? And even if he does, there's nothing good in that.
Well, and why would we want to pray to him? And this is my question.
That's right.
Why would you then turn around and have evening prayers to a God you've just decided was a monster? That's what I'm trying to grapple with.
But if God is worthy of being called God, then there must be something that goes with it that means that he is good. And so even when all the evidence points the other way, there's this kind of stubborn faith, and that's where I get the title from, that takes that next step and said, well, if God is actually worthy of being God, then I have to trust that he is good, even when my current circumstances and so much of the evidence seems to point the other direction, because God is something beyond that.
So God is good even when life is not good.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the challenges, is that whatever our faith is, and in this context of this series that we've been working through in Science Magazine, whatever the context of our faith, life challenges our faith. The inevitable experiences of life will be a test of our faith, and will often, question our faith in some pretty serious kinds of ways, because the reality is that life is not good. In so many ways. There is so much good about life and the world that we live in, but there's also so much that is not good and that we can't try and pretend it is. And so that asks some pretty serious questions about how can we believe in something good when so much isn't.
Yeah.
And so the stubbornness of faith that perhaps is needed for faith to be sustainable is that the goodness of God is something beyond the non-goodness of our experiences of life around us.
I guess the natural human inclination is to say, well, why would you practice religion or faith if you didn't get something good out of it? What's the point? What would you say to that?
Well, that's an interesting question, but what else do you do in some of these situations?
Yeah.
In Auschwitz, with these three scholars sitting around and saying, well, we've just found God guilty of crimes against humanity, but where else do we go? What other option have we got?
Yeah.
The only other option, and we could get into Viktor Frankl and his man's search for meaning, is to simply give up.
And he found that people who gave up in Auschwitz died, didn't he?
That's right.
Yeah.
And that's what he saw made the difference between the people who survived and the people that didn't, was to have something to actually hope for and something beyond themselves that kind of pulled them through their present circumstances and gave them, hope in that sense. Again, against all evidence to the contrary. But it actually in that case, it made an actual pragmatic and practical difference in their survival rates and how they were able to live well even in the worst of circumstances.
Yeah, so some sense of hope, some sense of meaning, transcendence might be a word we could use there, is actually something that can be incredibly sustaining for human beings.
Yeah.
Yeah, well.
Yeah.
But there are still incredible paradoxes there, aren't there?
Absolutely, yeah.
Difficulties.
And this story itself is the paradox of all, this idea that... But on the other hand, it's not so different from, you go back to the Bible and read the story of Job.
Yeah.
Everything goes wrong. All his circumstances, he's lost his children, he's lost all his wealth, his wife's telling him to give up, his friends are, accusing him of doing all sorts of wrong thing and bringing this evil upon himself. And, really he just holds on to his faith that somehow in the midst of this, that God is good and that there must be some kind of explanation behind it, but he never really gets that explanation.
Yeah.
At the end of the story, he kind of gets an affirmation from God that you're on the right track.
Yep.
But that's about as clear as it gets.
And I can hear what you're saying, because like earlier in the piece, Job says something in the, grand old King James version, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. This is Job, speaking of God. Even if God kills me, I'll keep trusting him, which is, some would not call that stubborn faith, some would call that blind faith. But nevertheless, It's something that Job just keeps clinging onto through thick and thin. Even though he's in the middle of yelling at God and criticizing God and asking God why, he's still desperately clinging on and saying, I'm going to trust you through thick and thin.
And he also has kind of this thing, if only I could get to God and sort of state my case, or, if only this could be sorted out in some way, I think it would make sense. And I guess that's a kind of stubborn faith, the fact that, if we could see a bit more of the big picture, perhaps we could see some rhyme or reason to what's going on here.
Mm-hmm.
In some of these situations, if you go back to the Auschwitz situation, that's almost impossible to do. To actually assume that there's some reason for it, because the whole point of evil is that it is inexplicable. If it made sense, it's actually the evil that is illogical.
Yeah. Yep.
I mean, a lot we sort of say, well, it's not logical to believe in God, but it's actually illogical. The evil is illogical, and that is part of the reason why we define it and understand it as evil, because we can't understand it. It doesn't make sense. There's nothing right or good about it.
I guess God created the universe in a certain way with certain laws, and evil then goes against the grain of that universe, which is a logical, rational, ordered place. So what you're saying totally makes sense in looking at it in that context. Evil is senseless because it doesn't conform to the laws of the universe and the way it was created to be.
Yeah. And so, when we get caught in these kind of situations, when you say, well, how can it be logical to believe in God because we see so much evil? The reason we recognize it as evil is because it is wrong. Mm-hmm. Which then pushes us back to say, well, if it's wrong, that's why we're calling it evil. That's why it's illogical. That's why we can't get our head around it. Well, that pushes us back to trust that there must be some kind of logic, there's some kind of right, some kind of goodness that sets up all of that as illogical and wrong and evil.
You're right, yeah. If we can identify evil, that implies there is a moral order to the universe. We know the difference between right and wrong. Where did we get that idea from? Must have come from somewhere. And,
there's very few people that would argue that the Holocaust, for example, wasn't an act of great evil. So what's our basis for saying that? And of course that we can have a long argument on from that jumping off point. But even just to stop there for a minute and say, okay, this is wrong. Why can we say that's wrong? And why do we read a story like this and say, well, these guys have been overwhelmed by the evidence of the evil around them. But then they're pointing back to this is why we can say this is not how it should be. There's this protest made to God in this act of proclaiming, announcing their verdict of God as guilty. They're saying, God, this is not how it ought to be. God, we believe better of you than this.
Yeah.
So it becomes its own act of faith to say, and throughout the Bible, this kind of spiritual practice of lament is basically an act of, a lot of people look at lament and say, well, that sounds, like you're doubting or like you're questioning, but it's actually an act of faithfulness to say this isn't how it should be. And we're appealing to a higher good, and in the biblical case to God, to say, hey, we need this to be set right, and we need the evil to be frustrated and to be removed and to be defeated. That's the bigger picture of what we're doing when we're identifying something as not right.
Yeah, wow. And I guess there's another Bible text that sort of jumps to mind for me in the New Testament. Jesus said some pretty tough things sometimes, and people struggled to hear them. And when he started talking about eating his body and drinking his blood, sort of prophesying, before his crucifixion, that sort of freaked a lot of people out, and they all disappeared. And Jesus, says to his 12 disciples around him, he's, the close guys who are close to him, and says, are you guys going to go as well? And the reply from the disciples is, where can we go? You have the words of life. And there's that sense of stubborn faith there, isn't there, that we don't understand what you're saying. What you're saying is actually really difficult to hear, and it doesn't even make sense to us, but there is something going on with you that we're just going to cling to. We're not going to let go of, because, there's a bigger plan at play here. Wow. And so later in the article, I actually used a quote from Eugene Peterson, which talks about this idea of, and he was talking about it in the context of worship, which kind of fits where these guys finished in their story. The idea about how we think that it's inauthentic to do something that we don't feel. But there's kind of this other way of looking at it, that when we worship, when we sort of commit ourselves to God in this way, then we actually align ourselves to
that way of thinking, that way of understanding what's going on around us, and it helps us feel. The way we act leads to a feeling rather than the other way, waiting until we feel like worshipping God. And I think I was fascinated by that idea even, and I know you've in the past talked with Darren Morton about how he talks about how we can change our feelings by the way we act.
Yes, yeah.
And that this brings a spiritual dimension to that. Rather than waiting, in Darren's case, he'd say, rather than waiting till you feel energetic and enthusiastic and then you go and do some exercise or go for a run or whatever, if you actually get out and go for a run, you feel energized and you feel more like it. After you've done it for a few minutes, you start to, your body kicks in and begins to feel the way that you're acting. Yeah.
Actually, it reminds me a little bit of something my wife says to me now and again when she's a bit upset at me. I say to her, "Oh, do you still love me?" She says, "I don't like you right now, but yes, I still love you." So
that's it.
So and I swear it's not because she actually is feeling love towards me at the moment. She just knows that is a deeper reality beyond that immediate situation.
Well, and even that's a choice that she has made.
Absolutely.
And continues to make. And I think both of those kind of examples can be used to help us understand how faith can fit with our lives. That and again, it's this stubbornness to keep making that choice even when we don't feel like it.
Yeah. No, the beauty of being an editor, Nathan, is that you get to sort of put words in your writers' mouths. And in this case, in your article, we added a little blurb at the beginning that says, "When you're angry at God, pray. When there's nothing left that's worth saying, pray." And that is sort of the experience that we see there in Auschwitz, that, when there are no more answers and the pray is something, like you're saying, it's a choice. You don't wait till you feel to do it. You just do it. So how do you pray in those sorts of circumstances?
Well, I guess my first answer is I don't know.
Fair
because
enough.
In these and even in our own experiences of desperate times when we're going through experiences of grief or tragedy or sorrow or frustration, there's something that is beyond us as human beings. But there is then this choice that we make to say, well, even in this situation, I submit myself to something bigger.
Yeah.
And so prayer is kind of doing that. It's reaching outside of ourselves. And even by just decentering ourselves from the experience, that becomes a helpful thing in helping us, get a different perspective on it. But we also believe that we're connecting with something so much bigger, so much better, so much more powerful, a so much bigger perspective on our current situation. And so I think that's a key part of what prayer is. And so, often we talk about prayer as, saying the right words or, reciting something or whatever it might be. And that can actually be a helpful thing, to recite something that isn't something we have to worry about the words. We can just, the Lord's Prayer, for example, can simply say, these are some words that we've been given that can help us reach out when we don't really know what to say.
Yeah.
But even by that process, that's a really good starting point. And often the hardest part of any conversation, even in human relationships, is starting it.
Yes, knowing what to say. Yep.
That's right. And how do you say hi? How do you say something to that person when it feels awkward, when it feels strained, when it feels desperate?
And sometimes the answer is, hey, if you have a friend going through a hard time, just be there. Like, your presence is important. And I guess we can do that with God too. We can say, God, I don't know what to say, but I'm here. I want to be in your presence, and I really, want to know that you are here in my presence too. That's it.
And, go from there. And, it's something that's hard to explain in that sense. But, there's a reality that many people have found to that. It's simply taking that step to reach out beyond, not waiting till we feel like it, but actually acting like we would if it felt like it.
Well, some pretty challenging thoughts there, Nathan. But thanks so much for your time today, for the article and for today's episode.
So I recommend reading the story because it's one of my favourite stories, and there's just so much to think about. So I'm glad to be able to share it.
Today's episode was based on an article appearing in this month's Signs of the Times magazine. A subscription is just $26 for 11 issues a year. To find out more, visit signsofthetimes.org.au. Signs of the Times has been published in Australia since 1886 and is proudly produced by Adventist Media.
This is an Adventist Media podcast.